The dog arrived before the hearse did. He was sitting on the top step of St. Brendan's Church when Father Aldous Morrow unlocked the heavy oak doors at 6:15 that Thursday morning, and the priest stopped walking when he saw him, key still raised, the cold air between them catching the light in long gray ribbons. The dog did not move. He was brindle-coated, dark around the muzzle, one ear torn at the tip in a way that had clearly not healed properly, and he sat with his spine straight and his eyes fixed on the door as though he had been waiting there long enough that he had forgotten how to do anything else. Father Morrow said something soft to him. The dog did not respond. He assumed someone would come for the animal before the service. He went inside and prepared the church for a funeral, and when he came back out 40 minutes later to speak with the funeral home director, the dog was still there, in the same position, as though he had not moved at all. What happened over the next several hours, what that dog did inside that church, and what was discovered about him afterward, would be talked about in the town of Calverton, Nebraska, for years. Not because people agreed on what it meant, but because no one could find a way to explain it that made the feeling go away. The man being buried that morning was named Harlan Voss. He was 71 years old. He had no wife. He had one son who had not spoken to him in 22 years, and that son was at that moment driving a rental car from the Omaha airport on a road that ran through flat winter fields under a sky the color of old pewter, and he was trying very hard not to feel anything at all. His name was Eli, and he had not planned to cry at this funeral. He had planned to do what needed to be done, sign what needed to be signed, and leave the town where he had grown up without stopping to look at it too closely. He did not plan on the dog. None of them did. The town of Calverton sits in the flat middle of Nebraska, in a way that suggests it was placed there without much deliberation. A water tower, a grain elevator, 2 churches, a diner that changes ownership every 5 years and somehow stays the same, and 412 people who all know roughly what everyone else is doing and mostly stay out of it. It is the kind of town that attends funerals. Even the funerals of people who were difficult. Even the funerals of people like Harlan Voss. Harlan had owned the largest working farm in the county, 460 acres of corn and soybean land that his father had built, and his father's father had started, and he had worked it with a ferocity that people respected from a distance and avoided up close. He was not a warm man. He was not the kind of man who got invited to dinners, or who sat on the church committee, or who showed up at the 4th of July celebration and made conversation. He paid his bills and he kept to himself, and when he had a disagreement with someone, which happened more often than it should have, he resolved it through lawyers and silence, in that order. His neighbors to the south, the Fenton family, had not spoken to him since a fence dispute in 2009 that ended in a lawsuit, and the removal of 3 old cottonwood trees that everyone agreed were beautiful, and nobody claimed until they were gone. His neighbor to the north, a younger farmer named Stokes, maintained a complicated arrangement of deliberate non-acknowledgement with Harlan that had lasted so long it had begun to resemble a kind of companionship. They nodded. They did not wave. The people who came to his funeral came because they were from Calverton, and in Calverton you came to the funeral. You did not have to have loved the man. But what no one in that church knew, what almost no one in that town knew, was what Harlan Voss had been doing every Wednesday afternoon for the past 4 years. That part of the story did not begin at the church. It began on a county road, in the dark, with a dog lying in a ditch that should have been dead by morning. To understand what that dog was doing in that church, you have to go back 3 years. And to understand that, you have to understand something about Harlan Voss that no one in Calverton knew. Every Wednesday afternoon, for 4 years, Harlan drove to the animal shelter in Ord. He did not tell anyone. He did not mention it in conversation, and since he was not a man who had many conversations, this was not difficult to maintain. He drove the 40 minutes each way in his truck, which was older than it needed to because Harlan saw no point in replacing something that ran. And he spent 2 to 3 hours at the shelter, doing whatever needed to be done, cleaning, repairs, occasionally helping with intake. Petra Isles, who ran the shelter's volunteer coordination, described him as the kind of volunteer who showed up every week without being asked and did whatever was in front of him without requiring acknowledgement or direction or conversation. She said once to a colleague that in 8 years of running shelter volunteers, she had learned that the people who showed up most reliably and asked for nothing were often people who were working something out. She did not know what Harlan was working out. She did not ask. That was not her job, and besides, the animals needed cleaning and the fencing needed patching, and Harlan Voss was there every Wednesday to help with both. He had started the year after he turned 67, the year after his last hired hand retired, and the farm became something he managed largely alone, with contracted help during planting and harvest and silence in between. 460 acres of silence, more or less, which is a great deal to fill. He had not set out to become a shelter volunteer. He had driven to Ord on an entirely different errand, something to do with farm supply, and had taken a wrong turn on the way back and found himself on a street he did not recognize, which happened rarely enough in this part of Nebraska that it registered as unusual. He had stopped to check his phone and had noticed, through the window of his truck, a building with a small sign that said Ord Animal Shelter, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Volunteers Welcome. He sat in his truck looking at that sign for a moment. Then he drove home. He came back the following Wednesday. Petra had asked him, on that first visit, what had made him stop in. He had said, "I was in the neighborhood." She had known immediately that this was not quite true and had not pressed it. She had given him a tour, shown him the kennels and the medical intake area and the outdoor runs that needed new gravel. And when she asked him if there was anything in particular he wanted to do, he said, "Whatever needs doing." He started with the outdoor runs. What Harlan Voss was working out, what he was not able to say to Petra Isles or to anyone else in Calverton, what he had not been able to say to Eli in 22 years of silence, was that he was a man who had discovered, late, that he was capable of a gentleness he had not exercised during the years when it would have mattered most. The animals did not know who he was. They did not know about the fence dispute or the lawsuits, or the particular quality of silence he had maintained for 2 decades toward the one person who should have been exempt from it. They simply needed feeding and care and the occasional presence of someone who was not in a hurry. And Harlan, who had spent a lifetime being in a hurry in the ways that matter and not in a hurry in the ways that do not, found that he was well suited to it. He became, in his Wednesdays in Ord, a different version of himself, not dramatically different, not unrecognizable, but softer at the edges, in the way of a man who has found a context that does not require him to defend himself. It was in this context that he found the dog. It was February, 3 years ago, when Dal Stamos, who ran the only auto repair shop in Calverton, was driving home after a late job and saw something at the edge of his headlights that made him slow down. It was 11 at night, on a road nobody used much, and what he saw looked like a pile of old clothing until it moved. He stopped, got out, found a dog in the drainage ditch, thin enough that the bones of his hips cast visible shadows, with 3 separate wounds that had all gone untreated long enough to show the particular gray-pink of advanced infection. The dog did not growl. He did not try to get up. He turned his head toward the light and then turned it away again, as though he had already finished with that kind of hope. Dale called the animal shelter in Ord, which was the nearest town with one. They said they could not send anyone out at that hour. He could bring the dog in himself or leave it. He did not leave it. He lifted the dog into the back of his truck as carefully as he could manage, drove 40 minutes to Ord, and stood in the emergency line of the shelter's after-hours intake at midnight. The intake volunteer, a tired woman named Cheryl, who had seen a great many things, looked at the dog and wrote the word critical on the intake form in a way that meant she was being honest about the prognosis. Dale went home. He did not think about the dog again for 2 weeks. And then he got a call from Cheryl to tell him that the dog had survived, which she described as something she had not entirely expected, and that he was available for adoption if Dale was interested. Dale was not in a position to adopt a dog. His wife was allergic, his house was too small, and he worked 12-hour days. But someone else adopted him. Someone Dale would not have predicted, and would not have believed if he had not seen the paperwork himself sometime later, when the truth about Harlan Voss came out. What happened at the shelter on the day that dog was adopted is a short story that took years to understand. The dog had been in recovery for 2 weeks when Harlan arrived for his Wednesday shift. He had not been told about the new intake. Petra managed the animal assignments, and the critical cases went to the medical volunteer team, not to the general maintenance volunteers. But the medical wing shared a wall with the outdoor storage area where Harlan usually started his shifts. And as he was working, he heard something through the wall, not barking, not the distressed sound of an animal in pain, though there was a quality to it that suggested recent acquaintance with pain. It was a single low sound that came once and then stopped, as though the animal had made it without intending to, and then thought better of it. Harlan stopped what he was doing. He stood there for a moment, the way you stop when something has interrupted a thought without fully becoming a sound. Then he went around to the medical wing door and looked through the window. The dog on the recovery mat was watching the door. He had been, apparently, watching it for some time. His eyes were calm in a way that seemed incongruous with the bandaging on his left shoulder and the visible ridge of his ribs and the general condition of a dog who had been in a ditch in February. He was watching the door with an attentiveness that did not look like anxiety. It looked like waiting for something specific. Harlan stood in the doorway, and the dog looked at him. He stayed there for a while. He did not go in. The medical wing had protocols, and Harlan respected protocols in the way of a farmer who understands that rules that seem arbitrary often exist for reasons that become apparent when you break them. He stayed in the doorway, and the dog watched him, and what passed between them in that hallway. What it was exactly, what Harlan felt looking at a dog who had survived something and was watching a door, is not something anyone can reconstruct precisely. But Harlan came back the next day, and the day after. He came during the week, off his regular Wednesday schedule, which he had never done before. Petra noticed. She did not say anything. And when the dog was cleared for adoption, Harlan was already in the building. Harlan Voss drove to the shelter in Ord on a Tuesday. Nobody in Calverton knew he went. He had not told anyone he was going, and he would not tell anyone afterward. The shelter records show that he came in, walked the kennels alone for about 30 minutes, and then sat down on a bench in the visiting room with an attendant named Petra Isles, who remembers him clearly because he was not the kind of person who usually came in alone and sat quietly for that long. He did not talk much. He looked at the dog, who had been brought out and placed on a mat on the floor across the room, and the dog looked back at him. The dog was still visibly underweight. He had a scar forming across his left shoulder that would pucker slightly as it healed and give him the look of a dog who had survived something specific. His eyes were dark and very steady. Petra said later that she had been ready to walk. Harlan threw the paperwork and explained about the medical history and the behavioral assessment. She had the folder in her hand. Harlan did not look at the folder. He looked at the dog for about 2 more minutes and then said, in a voice that Petra described as quiet in a way that seemed like it took effort, "I think he can come home with me." That was all he said. She processed the paperwork. She noted in the file that the adopter had seemed reserved but attentive, which was the shelter's language for people who did not perform emotion but clearly felt it. She gave Harlan a leash and a bag of transition food and a sheet of post-adoption care instructions that Harlan folded carefully and put in his shirt pocket without reading, the way people do when they intend to read something later in private. She remembered one other thing. She remembered that when she walked them out to the parking lot and the dog stepped onto the asphalt beside Harlan, the dog moved to Harlan's left side and matched his pace without being led. As though, she said, he had been doing it for years. Nobody used the word miracle that day. Nobody would use it for a long time. But it was already becoming one. Eli Vos had left Calverton at 19 years old under circumstances that were not unusual and were also not survivable in the way that matters. His mother had died when he was 12. Her name was Adeline, and she had been the thing in the house that made the house work. Not in a domestic sense, though she was that too, but in the specific sense that she was the translator between Harlan and the world, between Harlan and his son, between the man Harlan was and the man Harlan needed other people to understand him to be. She was the one who explained Harlan's silences in a way that made them tolerable. She was the one who told Eli, when he was 8 and his father had come home from a failed harvest and not spoken to anyone for 4 days, that your father loves you. He just doesn't have words for big feelings, which was not quite sufficient as an explanation, but was the best available one, and Eli had accepted it because she said it with such conviction. When Adeline died in January from a cancer that had been diagnosed in September and had moved with the particular speed that some cancers move, the translation stopped. And without it, what was left between Harlan and Eli was the original language, the one they had never learned to speak directly. Harlan responded to Adeline's death by becoming smaller. This is not the expected way of describing grief, but it is the accurate one. He did not become angrier or louder or more visibly broken. He became compressed. He worked more and spoke less, and the farm absorbed him in a way that might have looked, from a distance, like a man coping through purpose, but felt, from 12 years old in the same house, like a man who was no longer fully in the room. Eli had needed something in the years after his mother died that Harlan was not capable of giving. He had understood this, slowly and without language, the way children understand things they are not yet old enough to articulate. He had understood that his father was a good man in the abstract and an absent one in practice, and that the absence was not malicious, it was structural. It was built into Harlan, the way certain things are built into people before they understand themselves well enough to change them. This did not make it easier. By the time Eli was 15, he and Harlan had settled into a pattern that resembled a household being run by two people who had never quite met. They ate at the same table. They discussed practical things. The silences between them were not hostile. They were just large, the way silences become when no one has the vocabulary to fill them, and no one wants to risk the wrong word. Eli had a teacher in high school, a woman named Mrs. Galicki, who taught English and had the quality of certain teachers, who see the child in the room that the room does not see. She had noticed Eli in his junior year, not because he was troubled. He was not, particularly, at least not in any visible way, but because she had the sense that he was carrying something heavy and had been carrying it for so long he had stopped noticing the weight. She gave him books. Not assigned books, extra books, books she thought he would want, handed over at the end of class without comment. He read them at night in his room, and they gave him a language for things he had been experiencing without names. And they gave him, more usefully, a sense that there was a world elsewhere in which the things he felt would be recognizable to other people. He applied to programs. He got in. He did not tell his father until the acceptance was already there. The argument that followed was not their worst argument. That is the thing about the last conversation. It is rarely the worst one. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the corn already in, the fields gray-brown and empty under an overcast sky, and Eli had come into the kitchen where Harlan was going over invoices. At the table, and said what he had been building to for months. "I got in. To a program in Denver. I'm going." Harlan did not look up from the invoices immediately. When he did, his face had the expression it had when he was doing calculations. Not calculating what to say, but calculating what the situation cost. Eli had watched that face do that his whole life and had never been able to read it completely. What Harlan said was a single sentence. "Eli has never told anyone what it was." Whatever it was not the right sentence for that moment, which is the kind of thing you can only know in retrospect, and which Harlan had. It later became clear, spent years knowing. Eli left 3 days later. He called once from Denver when he had arrived. Harlan answered and said okay, in a particular way that meant nothing, and also meant a great deal, and they did not speak again for over 2 decades. What Eli did not know, because he could not have known, because Harlan never told him. His father had kept every letter Eli never sent. Not letters Harlan had written and mailed. Letters Eli had written and not mailed. Letters that Harlan had somehow known about and gathered and kept, which made no sense and also, as with so many things about Harlan Voss, made a particular terrible kind of sense. But that is getting ahead of the story. What matters right now is the morning of the funeral, and the dog on the steps, and what Father Morrow decided to do. Father Aldous Morrow had been the priest at St. Brendan's for 11 years, and he was a practical man in the way that people who work with grief professionally tend to become practical. He had seen a great many things in the context of funerals that he could not fully account for. The timing of lights, the behavior of animals, the particular way that people who had not wept in years sometimes came undone over small and specific details. He did not dismiss these things. He also did not reach for explanations too quickly. He had grown up on a farm in Iowa, the second of 4 children, and he had spent enough of his life around animals to know that they noticed things and responded to things that people missed. He had a neighbor growing up whose cow had stood outside the barn door for 2 hours before the family knew anything was wrong inside. He had a dog as a child who had refused to enter a room for 3 days before a pipe burst in the wall. He was not a superstitious man, but he was a man who paid attention to what animals paid attention to, and that morning, looking at the dog on the steps of his church, he paid attention. The dog's posture was not that of a stray looking for warmth or food. He was not huddled or shivering or scanning the grounds for an opportunity. He was sitting upright, spine straight, face forward, in the specific posture of a dog on watch. His eyes did not move to follow the birds that crossed the parking lot. His nose did not lift toward the kitchen smells coming from the church hall where someone was already setting up for the reception. He was watching the door of the church with a fixed attention at Father Morrow, standing in the cold November morning with his key still in his hand, recognized as something he had seen before but rarely. He had seen it once in a family sheepdog, at the graveside service of a man who had worked sheep all his life, the dog sitting 3 feet from the casket and not moving for the entirety of the service. He had seen it once in a cat, inexplicably, at a funeral home in Ord that kept a cat on the premises. The cat had spent the entire service for a 90-year-old woman asleep on the step below her casket, which the woman's grandchildren had found comforting in a way they couldn't quite explain. What he saw in this dog was the same quality, distilled. Something had brought this animal here, and whatever it was not over yet. When the funeral home director, a compact man named Blevins, who had the careful movements of someone accustomed to silence, arrived at 9:15 and found the dog still on the top step, he looked at the dog for a moment and then looked at Father Morrow. Father Morrow said, "He has been there since before I arrived. He will not move. I have tried." Blevins considered this. He was not a man given to sentiment, and he had a schedule to keep, and he attempted to move the dog by placing a hand on his collar. The dog did not bite. He did not lunge. He simply rotated his head and looked at Blevins with an expression that Blevins would describe later as the most uncanny thing he had encountered in 30 years of funeral work, which was that the dog did not look like a dog who was being stubborn. He looked like a dog who was exactly where he was supposed to be. Blevins let go of the collar. He and Father Morrow looked at each other. Father Morrow said, "I think perhaps we let him stay." The hearse arrived at 9:45. The dog watched it come up the church road without moving, and when the casket was carried up the steps past him, he turned his body to follow it with his eyes, and then he stood and he followed the pallbearers inside. No one stopped him. What happened next, no one who was there that morning had a clean way to describe. The church filled slowly, the way churches in small towns fill for complicated funerals, not with warmth exactly, but with the kind of collective decency that is its own form of warmth, the acknowledgement that a man's death deserves a room full of faces regardless of how the man conducted his life. About 60 people came. Some had driven in from neighboring counties. A few were farm business contacts who sat near the back and kept their coats on in a way that communicated obligation without pretending it was more. The dog walked the center aisle. This is the thing that everyone who was there remembers. He did not sniff the pews. He did not veer or wander. He walked the center aisle at a deliberate pace, and when he reached the third pew on the left side of the church, he stopped. He turned and sat down in the aisle beside that pew, as though he had been to this church before, as though he knew exactly which row it was. Donna Kettner, who was sitting in that pew, and who had known Harlan Voss for 40 years, said later that she felt something go wrong in her throat when the dog sat down beside her, because that pew was where Harlan had always sat. Always, for as long as she could remember. Third pew on the left. She had not told the dog that. No one had. The dog sat there for the entirety of the service. He did not make a sound. He did not react when people sang, or when Father Morrow's voice rose at certain passages, or when the woman in the second row began to cry in the way that she had been trying not to cry since she arrived. He sat beside Harlan's pew, and he looked at the casket at the front of the church, and his expression, if you can use that word for a dog, and everyone who was there that day insists you can, was not distress. It was something closer to vigil, the thing that nobody knew yet, the thing that would not become clear until later that afternoon, when Eli Voss opened a wooden box that he found under his father's bed, was that this dog had already kept vigil for Harlan Voss once before, in a way that no one had witnessed, in a farmhouse 11 miles from that church for 3 days in the dark. But Eli had not arrived yet, and the part of the story that would undo him had not yet begun. He pulled into the parking lot of St. Brendan's at 9:52, 8 minutes after the service had started, having driven through the morning in a silence that was not peaceful, but was at least contained. He was 41 years old. He had a life in Denver that was real and full and good, a wife named Margot, 2 children whose names were Felix and June, and he had not told them much of this trip except that he needed to go and he would be back. He had not slept well. He had not slept well for the 3 nights since he had gotten the call from Blevins, a professional and careful call, as all of Blevins' calls apparently were, conveying the necessary information in the minimum necessary language while leaving room for whatever the recipient of the call needed to do next. What Eli had needed to do next was sit at the kitchen table in Denver for a long time while Margot sat across from him and did not push him toward any particular feeling. He had felt something. He could not have said with clarity what it was. Not grief exactly, because you cannot grieve cleanly someone you have been grieving in pieces for 22 years. Not relief, because whatever you might say about the silence between him and his father, Eli had never wished for this particular end to it. Something between the two, the feeling of a door closing that had been stuck half open for so long you had stopped noticing the draft. He had not told Margot about the last argument. He had never told her. He had told her that he and his father were estranged, which was true, and that it was complicated, which was also true, and she had understood enough not to ask for more, because she was the kind of person who trusted that what she needed to know would come to her when the time was right. Over 15 years of marriage, she had been proven correct in this, so many times that it had become a kind of faith between them. He drove to Nebraska. He thought about his father for 450 miles. He thought about the kitchen table in Calverton. He thought about the morning his mother died, which was the morning a specific quality of warmth had gone out of that house and been replaced by something else that had no name, but that everyone in the house could feel. He thought about Harlan at that kitchen table, invoices spread in front of him, face lowered, and he thought about how he had spent the last 22 years in the comfortable certainty that his father was not the kind of man who had things to say to him, and that certainty was the reason he was only now, 22 years too late, driving toward Calverton, Nebraska, in a rental car. He had not told Felix and June about the grandfather they had. He had told them carefully that his family was complicated, which was the sentence parents use when the full truth is too much for a child, and they are not ready for the conversation. Felix had accepted this with 7-year-old equanimity. June had asked once, when she was 5, whether everyone has grandpas, and Eli had said yes usually, and June had said okay, and moved on to something else. And Eli had sat with the smallness of that exchange for longer than was useful. He had not told them about the farm. He had not told them about the fields, or the barn, or the particular smell of Nebraska in the fall that is unlike any other smell in any other place, or the way the light falls on flat land differently than it falls on mountains, or the fact that on a clear night in October you can stand in a field in Calverton and see more stars than most people see in their lives. He had not told them any of it because telling them would have required telling them more, and telling them more would have required having a conversation with himself that he had been postponing with considerable skill for most of his adult life. Now he was parking a rental car in Nebraska in November, and his father was already in a box at the front of a church, and that particular calculation had closed. He sat in the car for 2 minutes. Then he got out, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the church doors. He did not notice, when he climbed the steps, that there was a worn collar on the top step with a small metal tag attached to it. It had slipped off in the night, and nobody had picked it up. He walked past it without seeing it. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. He was at the back of the church, in the doorway, when the dog turned his head. This is what Donna Kettner saw from the third pew on the left. The dog, who had not turned his head once during the entire service, who had sat through the hymns and the readings and the silent prayer with the stillness of a dog who was finished with movement, turned his head toward the back of the church when the door opened. And then he stood up, and he walked, not quickly, not frantically, but with the same deliberate purpose with which he had walked the aisle to begin with, toward the back of the church, toward the door, toward the man standing in the entrance who had not been inside a church in a very long time. Eli looked down. The dog sat at his feet. He looked up at Eli. He did not wag his tail. He did not make a sound. He simply sat and looked up at him in the specific way that certain animals look at certain people that is very difficult to describe with accuracy, not with recognition exactly, because Eli had never met this dog, and the dog had never met Eli, but with something that was adjacent to recognition, something that said, "There you are. I have been waiting." The entire church had turned to look. Father Morrow paused his reading. Eli stood absolutely still in the doorway for a moment that seemed to last longer than moments usually do, and then he walked, with the dog beside him, down the center aisle to the third pew on the left, and he sat down in his father's seat. He had not planned to sit there. He had not known it was his father's seat. He would find out later from Donna, who was sitting beside him, who was already crying in a way she had stopped trying to prevent. No one spoke. Father Morrow continued the service. But something had shifted in that church in a way that everyone felt and no one had words for yet. The service lasted 45 minutes. Eli sat through it in the strange stillness of someone who had come from a great distance and arrived in a place that was both familiar and entirely changed. The church was the same church he had attended as a boy, the same dark wood, the same quality of light through the high windows, the same particular smell of old stone and candle wax, and something indefinable that every old church in a cold climate carries. He had sat in this building hundreds of times. He had not been in it since he was 19. He looked at the casket at the front of the church. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the man inside it, tried to summon the full weight of who that man was, and found, as he sat in the third pew on the left with a dog he had never met pressing lightly against his shin, that the weight was more complicated than he had prepared himself for. Not lighter, but differently shaped. He had spent 22 years carrying a version of his father that was composed primarily of what his father had failed to be. And now, in this church, in this pew, he was starting to feel the presence of something else, something he did not yet have information for, something that would only become clear that afternoon in a farmhouse at the end of a gravel road. A dog did not leave his side. When the service ended and the pallbearers came for the casket, the dog watched them from the pew. He watched the casket carried back down the aisle and through the doors. He watched the doors close. Then he turned and looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him. He said quietly, in a voice that was only for the dog, "Who are you?" The dog looked at him for a moment. Then he stood up and moved to stand beside him, pressing his flank against Eli's leg. And Eli put his hand on the dog's head without thinking about it, without deciding to, the way you reach for something that is already exactly where your hand needed to be. The reception afterward was held in the church hall, the small attached room with folding tables and bad coffee, and the kind of food that good women in small towns produce for funerals almost reflexively: casseroles, pies, bread that was warm in a way that felt like an act of mercy. Eli stood near the door and received condolences from people who had known his father and who spoke to him carefully, aware that they were navigating something complex, aware that 22 years was a long time and that the look on Eli's face was not simply grief. It was the look of someone who had arrived too late for a conversation. The dog stayed beside him the entire time. He did not wander to the food tables. He did not respond to the several children who tried to pet him. He stayed at Eli's left side, and when Eli moved, he moved. And when Eli stopped, he stopped. And by the time the room was half empty, Donna Kettner had pulled Eli aside and told him about the third pew on the left and watched Eli's face do something complicated and careful, the way a face does when it is receiving information it has no framework for yet. Then Dale Stamos came over. Dale had been debating whether to say anything. He had told himself it was not his business, and then he had looked at the dog standing beside Eli and decided that it was, in fact, his business, because he was the person who had found that dog in a ditch 3 years ago, and he had a feeling that was difficult to name, a feeling of something being completed, of a circle being closed, that he thought Eli deserved to know about. So he told him. The ditch, the midnight drive to Ord, the way the dog had turned his head toward the headlights before Dale stopped. All of it. Eli listened. His face was very still. Ben Blevins, who had been standing nearby and who prided himself on knowing details about the people whose funerals he ran, said the shelter in Ord would have records of who adopted him, if someone adopted him, if it wasn't a stray that wandered. He was not a stray that wandered. They found that out 2 hours later when Eli drove to his father's farm. He pulled into the farmhouse driveway at 2 in the afternoon and sat for a moment looking at the place. The white paint had gone slightly gray. The covered porch had a new board on the left side, lighter than the rest, a repair that must have been made in the last year or two. The barn behind the house was larger than he remembered, or the same size, but memory had a way of enlarging open space, and now what it looked was simply old and solid and present in the way that structures are present when they have stood for a very long time in the same field and absorbed the weather of many decades. The fields behind the house were empty. What remained was stubble, the cut stalks poking up from frozen ground in neat rows that extended to the tree line a quarter-mile back. And above it all, the sky was the particular November gray of the high plains, a sky that looked like the inside of a stone. Cinder was in the car with him. He had not planned to bring the dog. But when he had walked to the rental car after the reception, the dog had walked with him and then sat beside the car door in a posture that was either a request or a statement. And Eli had opened the door, and the dog had gotten in, and they had driven to the farm in the particular silence of two beings who have nothing to explain to each other. The neighbor who had found Harlan, a woman named Ruth Carnan, who farmed the adjacent land and who had not been part of the fence dispute, had let herself in to check on things, and then called the funeral home when she understood what had happened. She had told Blevins. Blevins had passed on what was necessary. What he had not mentioned, because it had seemed like a detail rather than information, was what Ruth had found when she arrived. She had found Harlan in his chair in the living room. He had died, the coroner determined, from cardiac arrest, likely sometime on Sunday evening. The neighbor had come Monday and found him Tuesday morning. That was 2 days. But the dog had been there before her. The dog had been there the whole time. She had described it to Blevins in terms that were brief, because she was a practical woman. The dog was beside the chair. He was very thin, thinner than he should have been. He was not distressed exactly, but he was not moving. And when she came in, he looked at her in a way that she did not have a word for. And then he looked back at Harlan. And then he looked at her again. And she had understood, without being able to say how she understood, that the dog had not left. That the dog had stayed. That the dog had kept company with a man who had died alone in a chair, in a farmhouse at the end of a gravel road, and had not left his side. What Blevins did not know, and what Ruth did not know either, was that by the time she had arrived that Tuesday morning, Cinder was already gone. She had found signs of him. The food bowl near the back door, dry. The water bowl, also dry. A few dark hairs on the floorboards, beside the armchair, but no dog. She had assumed he had slipped out through a window or door left ajar. She had not thought much of it. She had other things to think about. It was not until the morning of the funeral, when Blevins arrived at St. Brendan's and found a brindle dog on the front steps, that anyone started connecting the pieces. And even then, it was not until Eli Voss walked through those church doors that the shape of what had happened began to resolve from something remarkable into something that had no word, that was smaller than the thing itself. Cinder had not left Harlan. He had stayed with him through Sunday night and Monday and Tuesday morning. And then, when Ruth came, when someone came, when Harlan was no longer alone, he had gone. He had walked out of a farmhouse 11 miles from St. Brendan's Church, through farm roads and county routes in the November cold, with worn paws and a thin body, and whatever it is that dogs carry in themselves, that is not a map, and is not a plan, and is not something that can be documented. And he had arrived at the church before anyone else did, and he had sat on the steps and waited. He had waited for Eli Voss, whom he had never met. He had waited for the sun. No one who was asked about this in the months and years that followed was able to offer a complete explanation. The veterinarian who later examined Cinder, a careful woman named Dr. Wynne Abril, who had been practicing in the region for 20 years, and who did not lead with mysticism in her professional assessments, said that the pads of his feet showed wear consistent with extended travel on hard surfaces, and that his weight was consistent with 2 to 3 days without significant food. She noted that dogs have navigational capabilities that are genuinely not fully understood by current science. She said, "There are documented cases of dogs traveling very long distances to reach specific locations. We do not know, mechanically, how this works in all cases. We know that it happens." She paused for a moment when she was done saying this. Then she said, "I have been doing this for 20 years. Some things you just write down and you don't add a conclusion, because the conclusion would be smaller than the thing." Eli did not know any of this when he walked into his father's house that afternoon. He knew only that the dog walked in beside him, went directly to the living room, and stopped in front of an armchair near the window that still held the impression of a man who had spent a great many evenings there. The dog sat down in front of the chair. He looked at Eli. Eli stood in his father's living room and felt something that was not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something that grief contains when it runs alongside something else, when the loss and the unresolvedness of a thing have been sealed together for so long, they have become one compound feeling that sits very heavy and does not have a single name. He stood there for a while. Then he went through the house, slowly, the way you go through a house you grew up in and have not entered as an adult, measuring the distance between the place you remember and the place you are standing. In the kitchen, the same table, a coffee cup by the sink, a calendar on the wall still open to October. On the counter beside the coffee maker, a small handwritten list in his father's script, the tight, deliberate handwriting that Eli remembered, that said only, "Bread, oatmeal, dog food, call Petra." He did not know who Petra was. He would find out. In the hallway, a photograph of Eli's mother that Harlan had hung in a frame that Eli did not recognize, which meant his father had reframed it at some point in the last 22 years, which meant his father had handled that photograph recently enough to decide it needed a better frame. Eli stopped in the hallway for a long time. He had not seen a photograph of his mother displayed in this house since before he left. He had assumed, and the assumption had been so comfortable that he had never examined it, that Harlan had put the photographs away. But a man who did not speak about his wife's absence would not display evidence of it. But here she was, framed carefully, hung at a height that suggested it had been placed to be seen from the kitchen doorway, which was where Harlan would have walked past it every morning of his life. Eli put his hand against the frame. He looked at his mother's face for a while, a face he had spent his whole life trying to hold clearly in memory, which had blurred around the edges, the way all things do over 30 years, and which was here, suddenly very clear and specific and present. He stayed like that for a while. In the bedroom, a made bed, a window that looked out over the back field, a knit stand with a glass of water that had been there since Sunday, and was now past the point of being water in any meaningful way, and under the bed, visible from the doorway, a wooden box. It was a simple box cedar, the kind used for storage or keepsakes, with a small brass latch on the front that was not locked. Eli stood in the doorway, looking at it for a moment. Then he went in and knelt on the floor and pulled it out. He set it on the bed. He sat beside it. He opened it. What was inside the box took Eli Voss 40 minutes to go through, and he would go through it again many times in the months that followed, and each time he would find something he had missed. It was not a large box. It was simply a full one, the way a small space can be full when what it holds has been arranged with care. There were photographs, 63 photographs, which Eli counted later, all of people he recognized, himself at various ages, his mother, and then people he had never met, but who were undeniably his. the specific combination of features that families produce and that are recognizable even in strangers. A girl of about 8 with his own eyes. A boy slightly younger with Eli's mother's jaw. Felix, June. His children, whom Harlan Goss had never met. His father had found photographs of his grandchildren. Eli sat with one of them in his hand for a long time. It was a photograph of June at what looked like a school event. She was wearing a yellow dress that Eli recognized from 2 years ago, and she was looking at the camera with the particular expression she made when she was trying not to smile, but was failing at it, the expression he had come to think of as her secret happiness face. The photograph had been taken from a distance, the kind of distance a phone creates when you zoom in from across a room, and it was slightly blurred at the edges from that zoom, but June's face was clear. He did not know how his father had gotten it. He would spend a long time not knowing. He would eventually figure out, piece by piece, that Harlan had found him online, not through social media exactly, but through a community organization in Denver that Eli had been involved with for years, which had his name in a newsletter. And from there, a photograph of a fundraiser. And from there, something that took patience and time and the specific determination of a man who had decided that seeing was better than nothing, even if seeing was all he was going to allow himself. There were 63 photographs. His father had been watching from a distance, the way a man watches who has decided he forfeited the right to closer proximity. The photographs were arranged in the box, not chronologically, but by subject. The photos of Eli's mother on one side, the photos of Eli at various ages in the middle, and the photos of Felix and June, his father's grandchildren, carefully placed at the front where they would be seen first, as though Harlan had arranged them for someone else, as though he had imagined and then arranged for the moment of opening. Eli set the photographs aside and looked at the letters. There were letters. Not letters from Eli. None of the letters Eli had almost written and then not written. These were letters Harlan had written to Eli over the course of 22 years, unsent. The dates on the envelopes went back to the year Eli left, and the handwriting in the early ones was the tight, controlled script Eli remembered from his childhood. And in the later ones, it was the looser, slightly trembling hand of an older man. And the letters themselves, Eli would not read them all that afternoon. He could not, but he read enough of them, or not what he had expected. He had expected resentment. He had expected the same compressed anger that had characterized his father's silence. He had expected a man defending himself, or a man accusing, because those were the only two modes he had experienced from his father, and he had spent 22 years assuming those were the only modes that existed. What he found instead was a man trying, in writing, to say things he could not say in person, saying them clumsily, saying them in a language that was clearly unpracticed, because Harlan Voss was not a man who had used the language of feeling often, and the early letters showed this. They were halting. They started and stopped. They backed away from the center of what they were trying to say, and then approached again from a different angle, the way you approach something that might hurt you if you come at it directly. But they were there, written over 22 years, addressed to a son who would not receive them, accumulating in a cedar box under a bed in a farmhouse in Nebraska. The word sorry appearing in the third letter, appearing again in the seventh, appearing with increasing weight and plainness as the years went on, the way a man gets to a word when he's had enough time to understand it properly. I was not what you needed. I know that. I did not know how to be. I handled your leaving wrong. I handled a lot of things wrong. Your mother would have known what to say to you, and I didn't have that. I didn't know how to be the translator and the thing that needed translating at the same time. I think about calling. I have thought about it many times over many years. I pick up the phone and I think about what I would say, and I put the phone down because what I would say is not enough, and I don't know how to make it enough, and I've been waiting 20 years to figure that out, and I don't think I'm going to. So I write it down instead. I know you won't read this, but I write it down because it is better than not saying it, even when not saying it to you is all I have managed. I bought a dog. You would probably think that's a strange thing to mention. His name is Cinder. He showed up at the shelter in Ord one winter, in bad shape, and I went in to do my Wednesday shift, and I saw him through the glass, and I don't know what it was exactly, but something about the way he looked at the door. Not like he was waiting to get out, like he was waiting for something specific. I know what that is, I think. I've been doing it a long time myself. He's been good company. He sleeps in the kitchen, which is where I said he would sleep, and by the second week he was sleeping in the living room by the chair, which is where he actually sleeps. I let that go. Some battles are not worth picking. I think about you every day. I want you to know that, even though there is no way for you to know it unless someone finds this box someday, which I hope they do, I think about the way you used to come into the kitchen in the mornings when you were small, before your mother got sick, when everything was still the way it was supposed to be. There was a way you had of coming into a room that made it feel like something was about to happen, something good, like you were carrying possibility with you the way some people carry an umbrella. I don't know why I think about that so much. It seems like a small thing to hold on to after everything else. But I do. I think about it a great deal. Eli read that paragraph, and he put the letter down on the bed, and he put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a while. Not crying exactly, something before crying. Something that was the physical weight of understanding arriving all at once, the specific heaviness of receiving, too late, exactly what you needed. The dog, Cinder, came into the bedroom quietly. He had been in the doorway. He crossed the floor and sat beside Eli, and he pressed the side of his face against Eli's knee and stayed there. And Eli sat with his hands over his face and did not try to stop what was happening, did not manage it or contain it, simply let it come, all the years of it, all the weight, the full accumulation of 22 years of silence, meeting the full weight of 63 photographs and a cedar box, and the letters of a man who had been writing to his son in secret for 2 decades, because he did not know any other way to love him. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing something particular to the fields. The long gold light that November sometimes offers in Nebraska, brief and unexpectedly kind, moving over the turned earth in a way that looks, if you are watching from a farmhouse window, like something being gently covered. There was one more thing in the box. Tucked into a small envelope at the bottom, below the photographs and the letters, was a piece of paper folded twice and a dog collar tag. The tag had the shelter's phone number engraved on the front. On the back, in his father's handwriting, in letters small enough to require effort, his name is Cinder. He has been good company. If anything happens to me and someone finds this box, please make sure he is taken care of. Eli read those words. He read them again. Then he reached down and took Cinder's head in both hands and held it the way you hold something you did not know you were going to receive and are not ready to put down. In the weeks that followed, Eli made calls. He talked to Petra Isles at the shelter in Ord, who remembered the day Harlan came in and described it with a clarity that surprised Eli. He talked to Dale Stamos, who said he had always wondered what happened to that dog and was glad to know. He talked to Ruth Carnan, who told him about finding Harlan, and who told him about finding the dog beside the chair, and who said it plainly and without embellishment, the way practical people report inexplicable things. The dog was there. He had not left. That's what I found. Eli asked her if she thought the dog had known, if she thought he had understood what had happened to Harlan. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think animals understand more about death than we give them credit for. I think that dog understood his person was gone, and I think he stayed anyway." She paused again. "I don't think he knew how to leave." Eli took Cinder back to Denver. The decision was not complicated. Margot had already said yes before Eli asked, which is the way decisions work in some marriages. Felix and June met Cinder in the driveway, and the three of them became immediately inseparable in the way of children and dogs that seems to require no transition period and no introduction, only proximity. Eli went back to Calverton once more in January to deal with the farm. He hired a local management company to handle it for the season while he figured out what to do with it long term. He spent 2 days in the farmhouse going through things properly. He took the box. He took the photograph of his mother from the hallway. He took the framed photograph that Harlan had reframed at some point in some ordinary hour, in a quiet house for no one but himself. He read all the letters over the course of that winter. He read them in the evenings after Felix and June were in bed, 1 or 2 at a time, the way you read something that you are not ready to be done with. He did not rush. His father's handwriting changed over 20 years in the way handwriting does, the early letters tight and unsure of themselves, the later ones looser, more willing to let words sit on the page without being managed. In the letter from 3 years ago, the one that mentioned the dog, Harlan had written a single paragraph that Eli returned to more than any other. I have been thinking about what I would say to you if I called. I have been thinking about this for a long time. What I keep coming back to is that I don't think I would say anything useful. I think I would just want you to know that I still think about the way you used to come into the kitchen in the mornings when you were small, before your mother got sick, when everything was still the way it was supposed to be. I don't know why I think about that specifically, but I do. I think about it a great deal. Eli read that paragraph many times. He read it until he had it memorized in the way that certain sentences get memorized, not because you intend to, but because they find the place where something important is stored, and they stay there. In March, Eli drove back to Calverton one final time with Margot and the children. They stayed for a weekend. He showed Felix and June the farm, the barn, the fields that were starting to show the first hesitant green of early spring. He showed them the kitchen table and the window that looked out over the back field. He showed them the photograph of their grandmother on the wall. Cinder came. Of course, Cinder came. The dog walked the farm the way he had walked the church aisle, deliberately, without hurry, as though he were going somewhere specific rather than simply exploring. He walked the perimeter of the backfield. He walked to the barn and stood in the doorway for a while. He walked to the spot beside the back fence where there was a worn patch of ground and a food bowl that had been left there and not moved, and he stood beside it for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then he walked back to where Eli was standing and sat down. Felix asked, "Is this where Grandpa lived?" Eli said yes. Felix considered this. He was 7 years old, which is old enough to understand that some stories end before they should, and young enough to accept that as a fact rather than an injustice. He looked at the house and then looked at Cinder and then looked at Eli. He said, "Cinder misses him." Eli said yes. "I think he does." Felix nodded, the serious nod of a child who has received information and is processing it fully. Then he ran off toward the barn because there was a barn cat visible in the door, and the priority had changed, and June ran after him, and Margot stood beside Eli and took his hand, and they watched their children disappear into the barn that Eli had disappeared into 1,000 times as a boy. Cinder sat beside Eli. He did not follow the children. He stayed. The last thing Eli did before leaving Calverton that March was go back to St. Brendan's. He had not planned to. He was driving past on the way out of town, and he pulled into the parking lot without really deciding to. The way you make certain decisions that do not feel like decisions until they are already made. He went inside alone, leaving Margot and the children in the car. He stood in the empty church, which was quiet in the way of old buildings that have absorbed a great deal of human sound over time and sit with it in the walls. He walked down the center aisle. He stopped at the third pew on the left. He sat down. He sat in the church where his father had sat for decades, in the same seat, in the same silence, and he tried to imagine what his father had felt in that silence. He had been trying to imagine it for months, through the letters and the photographs and the long evenings reading words written to no one. He was not sure he had gotten there yet. He was not sure he would, but he sat for a while. He sat in the quiet, and he thought about his father as a young man with a wife and a child, before everything, and then as an older man alone, and then as a man in a chair in a farmhouse at the end of a gravel road with a dog at his feet, and then as an absence, as the specific kind of absence that a person becomes when the last conversation you had with them was at 19 years old and there was so much left. He thought about the letters in the box, the 63 photographs. He thought about a dog who had traveled 11 miles to sit on the steps of a church in the cold and wait. After a while, he heard the car door open in the parking lot. He heard June's voice saying something he couldn't make out. He heard Cinder's feet on the gravel. He got up. He walked back down the center aisle. He pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped out into the March light, which was still thin, but was starting to carry warmth in it, the warmth that comes back every year whether or not you are ready for it. Cinder was at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at Eli, and then he looked at the door behind Eli, and then he looked at Eli again. Eli stood on the steps of St. Brendan's church for a moment, in the light, in the cold that was becoming something else. Then he walked down to where his family was waiting. There is one more thing. The collar tag. The one Eli had found in the wooden box, with the shelter number on the front and his father's handwriting on the back. He had it remade. He kept his father's note, kept the original in the box where it would stay. But he had a new tag made with the same words, and he put it on Cinder's collar in the kitchen one evening in April while June was doing homework at the table and Felix was arguing with his shoelaces in the hallway. And Cinder sat still for the whole process in the particular way he had, the way of a dog who understood that patience was a form of attention. The tag said, "His name is Cinder. He has been good company." Below that, in smaller letters, "Because there was room." He found his way home. Eli clicked the latch on the collar. He sat back on his heels and looked at the dog, and the dog looked at him. And in the kitchen, the lights were on against the dark, and the house was full of the sound of children and the ordinary, beautiful noise of a life being lived. And it occurred to Eli, sitting there on the kitchen floor with a dog he had never met, but who had known his father better than he had, that some distances cannot be measured in years or miles, only in the things we failed to say before it was too late to say them. And that sometimes, when we cannot close those distances ourselves, something else closes them for us. Something that travels 11 miles through the dark. Something that sits on the steps of a church and waits. Something that already knows which pew.